Hello and welcome to today's webinar on the China's Overseas Development Finance Database, hosted by the Global China Initiative of Boston University's Global Development Policy Center, or GDP Center for short. My name is Diego. I'm the data manager at the GDP Center. The GDP Center is a university-wide research center that works to advance policy-oriented research for financial stability, human well-being, and environmental sustainability across the globe. And so a bit of background regarding our China's Overseas Development Finance database. For over 15 years, China has been a vital source of development finance for low and middle income countries around the world, committing nearly $500 billion in public and publicly guaranteed finance since 2008. These loans are tracked in our CODF dataset, and it includes the loan commitments from the Export-Import Bank of China, as well as the China's Development Bank. And with lending far below the peak levels that were witnessed from 2015 to 2017, we want to know what are the current trends in China's overseas development finance, and what do these trends reveal about the potential future of China's overseas lending overall. And so we have, at the GDP Center, recently published the update to our database with an accompanying policy brief entitled Peer-to-Peer Lending, China's Overseas Development Finance Pivots to National and Regional Development Banks. I'm thrilled to be joined today by the authors of the paper and my colleague, Rebecca Ray, Senior Academic Researcher at the GDP Center's Global China Initiative, and Mengdi Yue, GDP Center Independent Researcher. So I'd like to ask Becky and Mengdi to give us a brief overview of the project, the findings of the paper, a demo of the database, how to use it, and then we'll move into an informal conversation. With that, please take it away, Becky. Thank you.
Thank you, Diego, for that introduction. I'll go over a few of the basic points, pass it over to Mengdi, who will explain points more associated with energy lending and its implications for climate, and then I'll go through a quick demo of the interactive and how to use it. As an overview, in 2024, we find that China's development finance institutions, or DFIs, extended $6.1 billion in public and publicly guaranteed, or PPG, lending, in line with the annual average of $6.2 billion since 2020. But this is significantly down from the annual average of $36.7 billion per year from 2008, the previous global business cycle peak, through 2019. As Diego mentioned, national and regional development finance institutions are rapidly emerging as the major borrowers from Chinese DFIs. They now account for 44% of lending over the last 5 years. Meanwhile, direct project finance from Chinese DFIs has dramatically declined. This may be beneficial for several reasons, one of which is that those remaining directly financed projects have significant social and environmental risks that have been rising, as a matter of fact, over the last few years. I'll explain more about those risks and how we measure them in a few minutes. Mengdi will explain that fossil fuel lending has completely disappeared since 2021. We see no lending for coal, gas, or oil extraction, refining, or generation since that time. But new green energy commitments haven't emerged to take their place, indicating the need to develop new platform development processes, for example, through the Green Investment and Finance Partnership that we can discuss more in a few minutes. Here we'll see some details. In red, this is a graph of the total value of development finance in CODF from 2008 through 2024, and in blue, the number of commitments. We can divide this whole time period into 3 main chapters. First, from 2008, the previous global business cycle peak, through 2012, we see China reacting to the North Atlantic financial crisis as the global South faces a credit crunch and turns to China for additional financing, and China responds. It then falls back, but not quite to its earlier level. In late 2013, China announces the Belt and Road Initiative, and we see that lending take off again and accelerate rather dramatically before it again declines. Since 2020, we've seen very steady low levels of finance at about never more than $10 billion per year. As I mentioned earlier, newly important are regional development banks and local national development banks as borrowers from China. What you see in this graph here are CODF finance sector loans, meaning loans through financial intermediaries, be they regional development banks, RDBs, national development banks, NDBs, or other national government development finance arms. Um, we can see that this sector has grown dramatically as a share of total lending, now accounting for 44% of the total in the last few years. Nearly half of all CODF finance goes through these institutions now. Even though it has fallen significantly in total amount of money, it hasn't fallen by nearly as much as overall lending has, meaning it is the remaining most important sector. And this is potentially beneficial for several reasons that we can get into in the discussion, but among those reasons are the social and environmental risks associated with the remaining projects, the ones that are directly financed by Chinese DFIs. We track three different kinds of social and environmental risks, not because they're the only risks that matter, but because these particular kinds of risks have globally harmonized definitions, meaning they mean the same thing in every part of the world. Those three things are potential critical habitats, indigenous peoples' lands, and national protected areas. We measure which projects overlap with each of these three sensitive territory types. If a project overlaps with one, it doesn't necessarily mean it is an unwise project, but it may require more active governance to manage those risks. Here we see what share of committed finance to specific projects goes into projects that overlap with each of these kinds of sensitive territories. Over the three time periods I mentioned, 2008 to 2012, 2013 to 2019, and 2020 to 2024, we can see for potential critical habitats and national protected areas a significant increase in the share of finance to specific projects, to direct finance projects. Those shares of overlap have gone up quite significantly. Now, over half of direct project finance is going into projects that overlap with potential critical habitats. The only kind of sensitive territory where the risk level has gone down is overlap with indigenous peoples' lands. On the right-hand side, we see the number of sensitivities of each loan, whether it overlaps with 0, 1, 2, or 3 of these sensitive territory types. Where I want you to specifically notice is that the number of projects or the share of finance that goes into projects that have no overlaps with sensitive territories, 0 here, has gone down dramatically from nearly 60% to just over 1/3 of that finance doesn't have one of these kinds of risks. So given the continuing difficulties of managing projects from sometimes tens of thousands of miles away, there are really strong benefits to going through national and regional development banks who have that local expertise and are physically located closer to the projects. Now I'll turn it over to Mungdi to discuss energy and climate implications.
Thank you, Becky. So one of the findings that we have from the 2024 data is that China's DFI lending to the energy sector fell significantly to only about 10% of all CODF. If we look at CODF trends by sector, in the pre-BI period from 2008 to 2012, Chinese DFIs issued primarily large discretionary loans to the energy sector, for example, to state-owned oil companies or to the governments, which is reflected in the gray bars in the chart. And then in the early BI period from 2013 to 2019, there was a shift of lending to more direct project support, especially for energy and transportation projects. To note that energy sector alone received over 1/3 of all CODF during this period. And then moving on to 2020 to 2024, the COVID era, there has been a rise in medium-sized loans to national and regional development banks, just as Becky mentioned. And these are all labeled as the finance sector in the CODF database. If we break down CODF energy lending from China by source and subsector, our data shows a sharp contraction of lending to fossil fuel projects since 2020. It seems that not only coal power plants, but also all fossil fuel projects just disappear from the DFI's lending schedule. In comparison, in the pre-BI period, Chinese DFI's lending was concentrated at the both ends of energy value chain, including upstream like extraction or downstream like power transmission. And in the early BI period, extraction grows as the pink bar in the chart shows, but so does generation, which are all the blue bars in the charts, especially fossil fuels and hydropower. But since 2020, in the past 4 years, the only remaining significant energy sectors are hydropower generation and power transmission. Despite the sharp decline in Chinese DFI lending to overseas fossil fuel projects, their lending to renewables have not really risen. They are still very limited in scale. We want to cover three main sources of energy here. First, hydropower. Hydropower used to be significant in Chinese DFI lending before 2020. It received billions of US dollars. But now, like from 2020, we see a very small amount, about 700 to 800 million US dollars going to hydropower, and the lending is concentrated mostly in Africa, with smaller levels in Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Nuclear lending to nuclear also is a little bit interesting. It peaked during the 2013 to 2019 period, but that was almost entirely tied to a single project in Pakistan. And there is no new lending from Chinese DFIs to overseas nuclear energy projects ever since 2020. For solar and wind, Chinese DFI lending to these sectors are much smaller scale and concentrated in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Some other technologies like biomass are even smaller in scale in the portfolio, such as like biomass received only 60 million US dollars in total, which is not shown in the graphs. Yeah, I'll hand over back to Becky for the demonstration.
Thank you, Mengdi. I'll go over the database interactives and how to use them online. If you point your browser to the URL for the browser, for the interactive, which you can see here, first you'll see a brief introductory screen, and if you hit Explore, you'll see a map of the world with all of the direct finance projects that are associated with specific project footprints shown in little icons throughout the map. Each of these pins has a color or multiple colors associated with it, and those colors go back to the sensitive territory analysis that I mentioned earlier. Purple indicates indigenous peoples' land overlap. Red indicates projects that overlap with potential critical habitats. Green, projects that overlap with national protected areas, and gray for those projects that don't overlap with any of those types of territories. If you scroll down, there's a list of all of the projects, those with and without specific project footprints. If you'd like to learn more about a specific project, you can simply hover over an icon like this Belgrano Cargas train line project in Argentina. If you click on it, you'll see an option to view it in the list. It'll automatically scroll down to where that project is in the list, and you can see it in context of all of Argentina's other borrowing from Chinese DFIs, both those loans without footprints, like this general loan to the Argentine National Development Bank, and these projects that do have specific footprints. You can click it again to return to the map. Now, if you'd like to learn more about the data itself or download the database, you can simply go to the About/Data download page, learn about our sources and definitions and other resources, and if you fill out the data request form, you'll receive an email with a link to download the data itself. Now, my favorite feature of the CODF Interactive is that users who submit a data use agreement, which just commits to a few very basic academic ethics, will receive two additional things. First, shapefiles that underlie this map, which enables spatial researchers to use GIS to come up with their own research, whether there are specific local, environmental, social, or economic factors that they'd like to trace associated with this network of projects. Secondly, you can receive a password to this version of the interactive, which instead of just having icons for all of the projects, shows you their specific geographic footprints and how they all relate and become one global network. Let me show you how you might use such a thing. On the left, in addition to the project locations, you'll also see map layers that can show the 3 different kinds of sensitive territories. So for example, let's click on National Protected Areas, and you'll see in green where these projects sit relative to the network of global nationally protected areas. If we zoom into Tanzania for a moment, you can see what this looks like on one national level. In pink are all of the footprints of all of the projects in CODF that have specific physical footprints. And this is a network of different projects, including, for example, the National Telecom Backbone Project, which has multiple phases. Here you see phase 1. Down here you see phase 2. And there's other projects as well in the country that you can see all together. For example, gas pipeline projects. So you can see how this network of infrastructure throughout the entire country covers almost the whole territory outside of those national protected areas. Gives you a sense of the scale and potential compounded risks and benefits of this whole network of projects when considered simultaneously. Now, to give you another example, I'll zoom out for a moment and zoom back in to northern Laos in the Mekong River Basin. Here we see a series of hydropower projects and the footprints of the associated reservoirs. Now, these range from quite small, at just 60 megawatts for this one, to quite large, 220 megawatts for this one. But seeing them together enables stakeholders to consider how linking up a series of hydropower reservoirs in one river basin brings compounded and cumulative economic, social, and environmental impacts, both positive and negative, to be considered jointly as communities, governments, firms, and other stakeholders consider how to interact with this network of projects. Now, if you would like the passwords, either for the geospatial files, the shape files, or for the password to access this version of the interactive, simply contact us through the About/Data Download page, and we'll be happy to provide both of those things. Now I'll pass it back to Diego for a discussion.
Thank you so much, Becky, for walking us through the database and for both of you for such a wonderful and interesting analysis. I would like to proceed with just a couple of questions for each of you. And I'd like to start off with Mengdi, if I may. Given the observed decline in Chinese DFI energy lending, should we interpret this as Chinese banks moving away from overseas energy projects overall?
Oh, that's a good question, Diego. I think the recent decline in Chinese DFI's lending to energy projects does not necessarily mean that they have lost interest in supporting energy projects abroad. Um, I think what we're seeing is more of a shift in how they're providing support moving forward. So instead of provide project financing directly, they are now more interested in lending to national or regional development banks. They usually have a few focus areas that the Chinese banks want their partner to focus on, like either for development or small and medium enterprises or energy and such. And then it's up to the local banks to decide how to use the fund and which projects to sponsor. And such arrangements usually include energy projects, given its importance in economic development and people's access to electricity. A recent example is the 800 million US dollars facility provided by China Development Bank to Brazilian Development Bank to support industrial and energy projects in Brazil, which include electricity and mining. So even if energy lending is not always labeled or tracked directly, I think it's still happening. It's just, although it's still small in scale, but I think it's happening just through different channels, like financial intermediaries, like what is reflected in our data.
Thank you. And on that note, regarding financial intermediaries, I'd like to ask Becky now, how should China, or how is China and how should they be leveraging these sorts of relationships, whether it's with the national development banks or regional development banks to further its own development goals?
Thanks for asking that. For viewers who are interested in exploring this topic more in depth, I'd like to encourage everyone to go on our website, bu.edu/GDP, and look up a recent paper that our colleagues actually wrote on called Blending from the Ground Up about the potential benefits and design of collaborations between global, regional, and national development finance institutions, how that might work in practice. But I'll give a brief overview of some of the potential benefits and strategies for such coordination. Some of them are financial and institutional, and some of them are environmental and social. As I showed in that bar chart on social and environmental risks, just from overlaps with sensitive territories, China continues to face challenges in managing these environmental and social risks or keeping risky projects out of their portfolio. When they're 10,000 miles away, it can be extraordinarily hard to manage those risks. As I said, just having projects with some overlaps in your portfolio isn't necessarily terrible. There may be indigenous peoples in some parts of the world who specifically request particular projects, and we do have examples of that in our database as well. But because of the sensitivities, these projects tend to require more active management, and that's incredibly difficult institutionally from tens of thousands of kilometers away in some cases. And so simply from a day-to-day project management process, particularly in managing the social and environmental risks, working through an institution that has local expertise can be crucial. Also, China in 2021 instituted new green credit guidelines that are highly ambitious and, in fact, admonish all banks to develop processes for social and environmental risk management, for example, including stakeholder consultation processes and direct, unimpeded accountability mechanisms so that when problems arise, they can be caught in time to be resolved and go back to having positive impacts, hopefully, for all of the stakeholders involved. But we haven't seen key performance indicators come out yet for those green credit guidelines, meaning that financial institutions don't have specific guides about how to reach those goals. And until that happens, it can be so beneficial to work through national and regional institutions that have a clear line of accountability with national legal frameworks in the countries where the projects are happening because the money is going through those institutions. On a financial and institutional setting, particularly as we consider moving into an era where solar and wind power, two sectors where China has really strong global advantages at providing the services themselves, these projects tend to be smaller in scale on the individual level. Managing many small projects can be prohibitively complicated for large financial institutions that can be many, many kilometers away. Going through local portfolios can be much more useful and much more feasible institutionally and financially, simply regarding transaction costs for each individual project. If those can be bundled at the regional or national development bank level, that can be much more financially feasible. Um, and this goes along very well with global conversations that have arisen in the last few years about the importance of country platforms, of national ownership of their own portfolios of projects. And so working with national development banks and regional development banks can be very compatible with that approach to development planning.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense, especially the point on accountability and how having an alignment there with the country's and national guidelines and law is critical. I'd like to now focus more on and just end with a final question for both of you, looking at the future. So I'd like to start with Mengdi. You know, we saw in the CODF data that there's limited renewable energy lending. And in this last era, right, 2020 to 2024. And so I'm curious to know, we see a lot in recent reports about Chinese activity overseas in energy. So I would like for you to explain a little bit the discrepancy there, given all of that activity that's happening, and also, regarding this dynamic, how do you envision that going forward?
Thank you, Diego. First, I think it's good to keep in mind that the CODF database tracks only public and public guaranteed lending from Chinese DFIs, which are mostly China Development Bank and Export-Import Bank of China. These institutions traditionally tend to focus more on large-scale, capital-intensive projects like fossil fuel or hydropower projects, which are hard to attract private sector funding otherwise. And now that we see more renewable energy projects becoming popular, especially solar, wind, or waste to energy or biomass, they are often smaller in scale and less capital intensive. They're also easier to get commercial lending. So I think there are a lot going on about the renewable projects that they may be getting money from commercial banks or even foreign direct investment from Chinese banks through their own corporate finance. But these channels are out of the scope of CODF database. So I think that's one of the reasons that the discrepancy appears. In addition, moving forward, I think another factor that might be relevant here is that Chinese DFIs are geographically distant from renewable projects in partner countries, which are often decentralized and scattered across local areas. As a result, such projects are probably more likely to be financed by national or regional banks, or even a local branch of a Chinese commercial bank like ICBC is easier for them to do the business there. And they're better equipped to support such distributed infrastructure. So I do see there is a possibility of continued increase of Chinese DFI lending to financial intermediaries to minimize the hustle of and transaction costs of filtering and selecting and following up with local projects, but they do support them in their own way.
Thank you. And Becky, do you have anything you want to add? And what do you foresee in terms of future trends for China's overseas development finance?
I'll be watching signs of two phenomena in particular. One is as countries, Chinese development finance has always been concentrated in a small handful of countries. For example, Brazil, Pakistan, Angola. A few countries have borrowed significantly more than others, and some of those countries now have significant debt overhangs. And so, as we see countries go through and eventually emerge from debt restructuring processes, those countries may be able to emerge again in cooperation with Chinese DFIs. Another thing to watch is, as I mentioned in the PowerPoint presentation, in China's 2023 BRI Summit, Belt and Road Summit, China announced the initiation of something called the Green Investment and Finance Partnership, meant to help develop new projects, a new pipeline of projects. And this is particularly crucial in areas like solar and wind, where China has such strong advantages, but these projects don't exist on paper yet. And so they can't simply be financed. They have to be imagined first. And sometimes that means a whole host of research has to be done ahead of time on potential demand if there's an energy access project into areas that previously had energy poverty. And in this, I'd like to point viewers to another recent publication through the GDP Center called Evaluating Regional Pre-Feasibility Facilities, led by my colleague Tsitsi Musasike, in cooperation with researchers throughout Southern Africa, looking at the dearth of these feasibility studies currently compared to the challenge of global energy transition. And so I'll be watching to see if this Green Investment and Finance Partnership that was announced 2 years ago at the Belt and Road Forum comes into fruition. If it does, it could signal finally connecting China's financial prowess, the national expertise of NDBs and RDBs, and the tremendous renewable energy potential and energy demand in the global south.
With that, I want to thank both of you again, Mengdi and Becky, for sharing your thoughts today. And obviously, thank you to the audience for tuning in. If you want to receive updates or regarding future events and research from the Global China Initiative at the GDP Center, you can subscribe to our newsletter at www.bu.edu/GDP. Thank you again.